Chapter 1. Going Underwater. John Ricardo always maintained that Woodward Avenue was the best route between Bloomfield Hills and Detroit. The massive freeways that swept into the city from the north were too often bottled up with traffic between 7 and 7:30 a.m. Although its path was broken by traffic lights, Woodward was, like the myth of the men in the chauffeured automobiles who used it, uncomplicated and direct. Twice a day, 5 days a week, at dawn and after dusk, the long, polished cars shuttled between the secluded suburban estates and the merciless grind of the American automobile industry. On Thursday morning, September 29th, 1977, Ricardo sat on the passenger side of the front seat, reading sales and production figures from the previous day, while chauffeur Frank Romica steered the dark blue, four-door Chrysler New Yorker south along Woodward. The two men had already attended Mass at Holy Name Church in Birmingham. It was, John Ricardo used to say, the only time of quiet he had all day. A 15-minute pause in the journey between his colonial home in Bloomfield Hills and Chrysler headquarters in Highland Park. As chairman of the board of Chrysler Corporation, Ricardo headed the nation's third largest automobile company and 10th largest industrial company. He guided the affairs of the 14th largest industrial corporation in the world. In the realm of big business, few were bigger. On 6 continents, in 13 different countries, 250,000 people filed into offices and factories decked with Chrysler's blue and white insignia. Chrysler was a parable of American industry. It had endured the economic slumps that viciously disposed of weaker companies, and had grown to spread the lessons of American ingenuity, productivity, and salesmanship around the world. In an industry that left no time for reflection, the final week of September 1977 was especially hectic. At 9 a.m. that morning, Ricardo would preside over a meeting of Chrysler's 9-man operations committee to decide whether to spend $72 million on a new luxury car for the French subsidiary. For men who spent $15 billion a year, the decision was almost routine, another pinprick in the tail of a dinosaur. The French plant, which sat on a languorous sweep of the River Seine outside Paris, was just one part of a corporation where every subsidiary, division, factory, manager, and worker needed money. The car, code-numbered C9, was an ordinary choice for big business. But in the fall of 1977, even the ordinary decisions were getting tougher to make. To outsiders, nothing seemed amiss. Chrysler and the U.S. automobile industry appeared robust. The 4 American auto companies were on their way to combined net profits of $5.2 billion in a year in which Americans bought 14.8 million cars and trucks. Like a rocket entering its second stage, rhapsodized Ward's Automotive Yearbook, a trade handbook. The United States auto industry in 1977 settled into the glow of 1976's stirring recovery from the severe 1974-75 business recession. At Chrysler, the comptroller's office was about to close the books on the 8th consecutive profitable quarter, the richest period in the company's entire history. Between the beginning of October 1975 and the end of September 1977, Chrysler had earned $668.5 million, and John Ricardo wasn't suffering. The previous year, he had taken home $700,066 in salary and bonuses. Ricardo knew that the spectacular financial performance was probably a fluke, though, and that, was only one of many things he had to worry about. His chief concern at the end of September was the reception that Chrysler's new 1978 models would receive. The sales department could normally project the likely annual sales from the public's response during the opening weeks of the new model year. Chrysler, Plymouth, and Dodge cars and trucks had been rolling across the country on rail cars for the past several weeks, and were being prepared in more than 4,800 dealer lots for the official introduction that weekend. For 1978, Chrysler was covering slightly over half of the U.S. market, with 42 models, compared to 138 for General Motors and 66 for Ford. This was an off year for Chrysler, a break in the remorseless cycle of entirely new models. Indeed, Chrysler had no genuinely fresh cars for 1978. Instead, the company was dropping 2 of its 3 full-size cars and keeping only the 4,800-pound V8-powered New Yorker Braham, the very car that Frank Romica was easing down Woodward. The launch of the restyled cars was going to be troublesome. Ricardo could scarcely remember when Chrysler had experienced a smooth launch. In 1969, the computers had fouled up the scheduling of production. In 1973, a new line of large cars had been launched into a market jolted by the oil embargo that followed the Yom Kippur War. And in 1974, the economy had taken a dive as Detroit had readied its advertising. Now, Ricardo's salesmen had to sell off an unusually large inventory of leftover 1977 vehicles, which were clogging the showrooms. Chrysler had enough cars for 87 selling days when a 65-day stock was considered about normal. Part of Chrysler's inventory was composed of cars not built to any specific order from a dealer. Inside the company and around Detroit, it was known as the sales bank. When it ballooned out of control, it brought all sorts of problems. And, to add to his worries, Ricardo had to live with a past promise. Just over a year before, he had made the mistake of publicly announcing, "When the markets fall off again, we won't have a big inventory around our necks to weigh us down." The 1978 models revealed Chrysler's and the rest of the industry's response to the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, passed by Congress in 1975. The act gave the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, the authority to start calculating the weighted average of each manufacturer's fuel economy, starting with the 1978 cars. Washington had never laid a firmer hand on Detroit, and by the end of 1978, each of the automakers was charged with producing cars with an average fuel consumption of 18 miles per gallon. For Chrysler, it meant maintaining a delicate balance between the 14 mile per gallon, 400 cubic inch New Yorkers and the 21 mile per gallon compact Plymouth Velares. Congress called the Balancing Act Corporate Average Fuel Economy. It was known and reviled in Detroit by its acronym, CAFE. It was clear that congressional legislation was going to change life in Detroit dramatically. Although the act covered a range of energy matters, the clearest message was that American-made cars would be required to average 27.5 miles per gallon by 1985. Incredibly, Congress had rejected suggestions by both the auto industry and the White House that the price of gasoline be allowed to increase gradually to help prod consumers into smaller, more efficient cars. That way, at least, Detroit would have an incentive to build them. Unfortunately, President Gerald Ford was not only unable to convince a Democratic Congress to deregulate fuel prices, he incited a rebellion that actually reduced the price of gas at the pump. On Woodward, Ricardo noticed gas station stickers advertising unleaded regular at 56.9 cents a gallon. A year before, those same signs had offered the same fuel for 60.9 cents a gallon. In a topsy-turvy world, Automobile engineers had to plan for a market that paid little attention to fuel consumption. The scare that had engulfed the country after the 1973-74 OPEC oil embargo had disappeared. Although the public had fled in a panic towards small cars, almost as soon as the oil started to flow again, they had turned and streamed back toward larger cars, loudly painted vans, and four-wheel drive trucks. For consumers, the choice was just part of the American way of life. For the men in the laboratories and offices in Detroit, it was an unremitting nightmare. If Chrysler failed to make the fuel consumption targets specified under the 1975 law, it would be fined $6.5 million for every tenth of a mileage point it missed by. On the other hand, if it introduced small cars too soon, Chrysler risked the loss of customers. You can prosper if you're a year or two behind, former Treasurer Bill McGaw remarked. You cannot if you're a year or two ahead. It was becoming clear to Ricardo that the market would go to the company that could build the biggest possible car with the lowest fuel consumption, something of a strain on the laws of thermodynamics. To meet the demands of the law, Chrysler planned to have half of its 1978 production geared to small cars, compacts or smaller. The 1978 model line also included 2 subcompacts imported from Japan. Having decided that outside purchase was the only way the company could afford to sell small cars, since 1971, Chrysler had been purchasing Dodge Colts and Plymouth Arrows manufactured by Mitsubishi. 6 years later, even with imported cars breaking all records by selling to 1 out of every 6 buyers, and with Americans buying nearly 2 million subcompact cars, Chrysler was still not big enough to expect a profitable share of that market. Even General Motors and Ford, with larger overall market shares and more dealers, could not make money from their own subcompacts. To be sure, analysts were predicting that small cars would take a larger and larger share of the market in future years, but none of them could tell Ricardo when that market would be large enough to allow Chrysler to turn some profits. All the more reason to worry. Faced with the vague prospect of a burgeoning small car market, a shaky energy supply, and federal fuel efficiency standards that all but required production of 4-cylinder subcompacts, Ricardo himself had grabbed the ring in the spring of 1975 and approved a minicar, as many in Detroit still called them. With a group of his top American and European executives, Ricardo had spent 2 days in April 1975 at Chrysler Europe's Design Center near Coventry, England, looking at mock-ups of cars an age removed from the era of Detroit Baroque. Part of the reason for Chrysler's slimmer profits in the third quarter of 1977 was the expense of final tooling for the car approved during that English spring. Ricardo was pumping over $40 million into Chrysler's Belvedere assembly plant outside Rockford, Illinois, where a turkey farm of robots was being installed in preparation for the launch of the company's new cars, the Dodge Omni and the Plymouth Horizon. Following a pattern established by General Motors, as most patterns were in Detroit, the automakers randomly assigned letters to each of their basic car sizes, known as platforms. The Omnis and the Horizons, long before they were given names, were simply called L-bodies. The L-body was to be the first small front-wheel drive car built in the United States. As long as fuel was cheap and plentiful so that cars could be big and inefficient without hurting the owner's pocketbook, front-wheel drive had been only an exercise for American engineers. The small car market of the future, whenever it became a reality, was going to place a premium on space, though. A revolution in automobile engineering and production seemed almost inevitable. General Motors was taking nearly 7 years and $2.5 billion to build its front-wheel drive X cars from bumper to bumper. Chrysler was able to adopt front-wheel drive in less than 4 years, and for half the investment, because its French subsidiary, the former Simca firm, had already mastered the design and production of the necessary parts. Chrysler was merely wrapping American engineering and styling around the Simca 1307. It was the first major advantage Chrysler had extracted from its painful 19-year bout with its international subsidiaries. While the French connection allowed Chrysler to accelerate its plans for a small car, the company did not have the $400 million or the 5 years it would take to develop an engine for the L-body. Ricardo had no choice but to buy from elsewhere, knowing full well that Chrysler would have to settle for a higher price and a limited number of engines. Fortunately, in 1975, as Gene Caffiero, then head of Chrysler's North American operations, started to shop for engines, West Germany's Volkswagen was contributing to a worldwide surplus of 4-cylinder engines. Chrysler agreed to buy 300,000 a year until it was ready to produce its own. The deal gave Chrysler a proven engine and Volkswagen an outlet for idle capacity. It was a precursor of the liaisons and alliances that would develop in an increasingly expensive and complicated automotive world. The L car was still a gamble, the biggest gamble Chrysler had taken in more than a decade. When the Omnis and Horizons arrived in January 1978, they would be 16 months ahead of GM's front-wheel drive cars, and nearly 3 years ahead of Ford's World Car, eventually sold as the Ford Escort and Mercury Lynx. The impending launch was a significant risk in a business that paid for mistakes in 9 figures. Motor Trend magazine, one of the leading buff books, paid tribute to Chrysler's gamble by naming the Omni Horizon its Car of the Year, and anointing John Ricardo its Man of the Year for 1978. Now, Ricardo had to decide whether to shovel out another $72 million on a European car at a time when the pressures to take more risks in the United States were just beginning to mount. The business was changing and the changes seemed to be accelerating too rapidly for Chrysler to keep up. The only company that seemed to have a chance of keeping abreast of the changes was General Motors. Nothing that Chrysler or Ford attempted seemed to make much of a dent in GM. In September 1977, GM was selling between 4 and 5 of every 10 cars sold in the United States. A Detroit investment analyst, Arvid Jupi, who had once worked for Chrysler, was fond of comparing the U.S. automobile market to a river through which a variety of customers swam. GM, with its large number of models, from subcompacts to block-long limousines, was like a fisherman with nets in every part of the river. Wherever the fish swim, Jupi would explain, GM has a net. In the years since World War II, Ford had survived by jostling its nets in wherever it could find some room. Chrysler, during the 60s, had attempted to fish across the entire river, but Ricardo had found that his more recent success had come in places where GM and Ford had left some room, in light trucks, vans, and compact cars. For safety's sake, he wanted to dangle more nets in other parts of the river, but it had become too expensive. American Motors Corporation, the industry's fledgling, at $2.2 billion in annual sales, had long ago decided to fish with small cars only. AMC had demonstrated one thing: building nothing but small cars in America might lead to a splendid cafe, but it was no way to make a living. In 1977, AMC remained in business only through the sale of its popular, profitable, and gas-guzzling Jeeps. Federal mileage standards were about to narrow the banks of Jupi's imaginary river. They would leave the company with the broadest range of cars, the greatest marketing clout, and the most money dominating the stream. The Energy Act of 1975, scoffed Wall Street analyst David Healy, should have been called the General Motors Competitive Advantage Act. It was a competitor's nightmare. Industry intelligence, less an elaborate system of spies than an informal network of gossipy suppliers who worked with more than one company and knew what each was planning, reported that GM was well on its way toward a complete turnover of its model line for the 1980s. The reports Ricardo gleaned from Automotive News, which was pushed into his mailbox hot off the presses every Sunday afternoon, bore similar news. He could only shake his head with a mixture of jealousy and grudging admiration when he thought of the executives on the 14th floor of GM's stone headquarters on West Grand Boulevard. It was difficult to understand that GM was intending to spend $5 billion a year on new cars for every year until 1985. Ricardo, with a mind that clicked like an abacus, knew that GM would be spending an average of $14.5 million every day, including Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, in every week, in every month, until the end of 1985, just for new plants and products. Romica turned the large New Yorker off Woodward, threaded through a narrow street lined either side with parked cars, and headed toward a short causeway that skirted Chrysler's headquarters. The quarter-mile strip was named Lynn Townsend Drive, after the former chairman of Chrysler. Townsend had been a powerful, intimidating man, whom Ricardo had followed, revered, feared, and on occasion, deeply resented. Townsend had retired as chairman in 1975 after 14 years, during which he had called most of the shots. Ricardo pondered something Townsend had said sometime before he left. "Look out for 1980. It was a joke, of course, a reference to the curious fact that Chrysler always seemed in trouble at the turn of the decade. In 1950, it had been a devastating 100-day strike by the United Auto Workers. In 1960, there had been disastrous financial developments, plus the great conflict of interest scandals surrounding Chrysler president William Newberg. And in 1970, Townsend had jetted around the country to save Chrysler in the panic that hit Wall Street after the collapse of Penn Central. Townsend had long been aware of Chrysler's potential fragility. In 1960, his vision of the future shape of the industry had been made clear during discussions with the management of Studebaker. Then the smallest of the U.S. automakers, Studebaker had proposed a merger with Chrysler. Townsend cut short the secret meeting held in a motel near Chicago's O'Hare Airport by telling Studebaker chairman Sherwood Egbert, "I'm not sure that Chrysler will be around in 1980. Ford might not even be around." In the late 70s, it was almost impossible to know what lay in store at the turn of the decade. The task wasn't made any easier by the rumors coming from Ford's glass headquarters in Dearborn. There were stories of conflict at the highest levels of the company. Wags in the basement bowling alley of the Detroit Athletic Club, where Ricardo bowled a respectable 164, passed on rumors that Henry Ford II, board chairman and family dynast, had overruled his president, Lee Iacocca, on plans for a small front-wheel drive car for the late 70s. Ricardo knew that Ford, like GM, planned to downsize its full-size cars in 1979. But the prospect of a Ford range of compacts that wouldn't change offered some encouragement. It was one less headache for Ricardo. Romica guided the car past a gatehouse and Ricardo nodded at the guard. The dome of the styling studio gave the Chrysler headquarters the air of an austere campus. In front of the drab, 5-story K.T. Keller building, named after a tough engineer who had followed in Walter Chrysler's footsteps, the familiar Pentastar flapped on the aluminum flagpole. As the car rolled into the Keller building's tiled garage, Ricardo snapped his briefcase shut. He swung his rounded shoulders out of the car and walked briskly to an elevator that carried him non-stop to the 5th floor and the teak-walled corridors of Chrysler's executive row. For an hour, Ricardo sat behind his hexagonal wooden desk, sipping coffee and preparing himself for the 9 a.m. meeting. A short briefing from two of his top managers was interrupted by a call from the head of Chrysler Europe. Ricardo took the call on a telephone that swung out below the top of the desk on a special platform. As he listened, his eyes rested on the autographed photo of Pope Paul VI that hung on the wall. Dismissing the two officials, he flicked through a summary of selected news clips and articles prepared by the Public Relations Office. During the company's heyday, the chairman had been treated to 4 editions. Now, it was down to 2. When Ricardo entered the 5th-floor conference room to chair the gathering of the Operations Committee, the assembly lines at all of Chrysler's Detroit plants had been running for more than 2 hours. There had been no special problems, no stoppages or shortages of parts. The wheels of the world's biggest industry, which once had attracted the most ambitious men in the United States, were turning smoothly and routinely. Most of the items on the agenda were settled with little discussion. Requests for extra funds to help with the new model introduction, and for several $100,000 for Chrysler's small outboard motor company, were approved informally. Ricardo himself reviewed, as he would with increasing intensity in the coming months, the company's finances, and listened to others report on production and cash forecasts. There were no surprises. Ricardo picked at some of the numbers with testy caution, a marked contrast to the smoother confidence of Chrysler's chief operating officer, Gene Caffiero. Caffiero sat opposite Ricardo at meetings of the Operations Committee. Although the two were both of Italian descent, they were living antonyms, and had little respect for each other. It would take the head of the psychiatry department at Columbia Presbyterian to figure those two out, Chrysler director Tom Killefer marveled. Ricardo was slight and gaunt. His $400 suit, bought from a Birmingham tailor, hung loosely, and his face was pasty from overwork. John Ricardo, said colleagues, walked in his sleep. Known to some as the flamethrower, Ricardo was more explosive than the truck he had driven along the Burma Road during the Second World War. Prone to violent outbursts, he was also a formidable corporate politician. John Ricardo, they murmured behind the black doors that lined the dimly lit executive corridor. Gets mad and even. Gene Caffiero was another matter. The son of a truck driver, he brought to the boardroom a distinct Brooklyn accent and smatterings of the psychology courses he had taken at Dartmouth before graduating in 1946. In pockets of the corporation, he gained the nickname Plastic Man, partly because of the willing way he returned calls from the press and quoted managerial consultants, but partly because of his fascination with exotic materials. His wife, Nancy, had helped design his office with chrome and lucite, and had even flown to Sandusky, Ohio, home for part of Chrysler's small marine division, to help select fabrics for the fleet of motorboats. Nancy is doing some design work, Caffiero told the Operations Committee once. Does anyone mind? No one objected, but the tittering had started quickly enough. Stocky and athletic, with strong, handsome features crowned by a thick sweep of dark hair, Caffiero toured plants like a movie star. With his sleeves rolled up, he preached a gospel of corporate community, exhorting his managers and workers to take risks and treat divisions like small, privately run companies. He once circulated a videotaped rendition of his philosophy through the corporation. Quality, he used to say, was everybody's responsibility. Caffiero was acquired by Chrysler along with Briggs Body in 1953 as an industrial engineer, a euphemism for a time-in-motion man. Thereafter, he rarely bothered to correct the occasional assertion that he was an engineer. He pursued a relatively undistinguished career in the stamping group, until Lynn Townsend plucked him from the obscurity of an Indiana machining plant to head Chrysler's oddly assorted collection of Latin American companies. Jetting from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and from Bogota, Colombia, to Caracas, Venezuela, and finally to a small, single-story factory guarded by reddish foothills near Lima, Peru. Cafiero ran a group, divided by language in the Andes, that was barely the size of one of Chrysler's North American assembly plants. Within a couple of years, he had leapfrogged over scores of more senior executives to become head of Chrysler's North American operations, the third most important job in the company. When Townsend retired in 1975 and Ricardo became chairman, Cafiero was promoted to the presidency. John Ricardo and Jean Cafiero collided immediately. Their first furious spat occurred over something completely arcane to outsiders, but critically important to the men who run automobile companies: the suspension for Chrysler's compacts, the Dodge Aspens, and Plymouth Velares. The decision, made in the early 70s, set the tone for the relationship between the two men. Chrysler had long relied on torsion bars, a beam that stretched beneath a car to weather the bumps and shocks of the road. The heavily advertised torsion bar was as much a part of Chrysler as the Pentastar. Cafiero, however, had decided that there was plenty of reason to change. He had driven some of the competition's cars and had been impressed by the ride, the lighter weight, and the lower cost of their coil springs. He convinced his colleagues and disappeared on a business trip, content that Chrysler would break with tradition and use coil springs on the new compacts. He returned to find that his colleagues were endorsing torsion bars with the same enthusiasm they had shown for the prospect of coil springs. John Ricardo had exercised his own powers of persuasion. "There are two things this company stands for," Ricardo had yelled at his associates: unibody construction and torsion bars. There was little room for reason, and even less when Ricardo implied that it would be torsion bars or their jobs. It was, needless to say, torsion bars. By 1977, the president and the chairman of Chrysler were barely on speaking terms. Ricardo had become increasingly disturbed by what he saw as the rapid deterioration of the company and had begun to hover over Cafiero. He was convinced that Cafiero was letting the organization run to seed. For his part, Cafiero complained that Ricardo would never sit still and plot long-term strategy. Ricardo, thought Cafiero, was barely capable of concentrating on the succeeding week. He resented Ricardo's usurpation of the chairmanship of the operations committee, a post that had traditionally belonged to the company president. Even their ideas about Chrysler's future were contradictory. Ricardo paid lip service to the importance of finding niches in which Chrysler could operate profitably, but he nevertheless exerted shades of the same relentless pressure Lynn Townsend had used to boost volume during the 60s. Cafiero, meanwhile, devised grand schemes to boost Chrysler's image. He correctly perceived that Chrysler was doomed if it kept selling cars to customers older and poorer than those flocking into Ford and General Motors showrooms. He knew that Chrysler buyers bought less frequently, relied more heavily on credit, and spent less on the highly profitable options. Cafiero had outlined his plans to the company's top 400 managers at a special meeting known derisively as the Fireside Chat, held in an auditorium near the big Chrysler tank factory in Warren, Michigan. Inside the auditorium, Cafiero rolled back charts and talked the managers through a slideshow. All Chrysler's cars, he said, pointing to the center of a dotted and circled matrix, overlapped. They were competing against each other as well as against the competition, and were aimed at the same group of stodgy, cautious buyers rather than at the range of people targeted by General Motors and, to a lesser extent, Ford. Chrysler had to appeal to younger, wealthier buyers if it wanted to survive. Some of the managers yawned and rolled their eyes as he talked grandly of transforming the Chrysler line into cars like Mercedes, Dodges into sporty cars like BMWs, and Plymouths into sturdy family cars like Volvos. They all knew he was fundamentally right, but it was a little like telling a seasoned football team that in order to win, they had to block, tackle, and execute plays without error. "Everybody's going to starboard. We'll take port," he announced. It was, by his own admission, a risky strategy. But Cafiero saw only one way out: by spending money on cars, and, most of all, on advertising. Gene Cafiero wanted to spend Chrysler out of trouble. Cafiero's blithe way with numbers made John Ricardo's hair gray even more rapidly. For all Cafiero's talk, Chrysler cars were still perceived as characterless and uninspiring, their buyers still old and poor. Relations with the workers who built them were still as tense as ever, and the quality of the cars that rolled out into the autumn morning was, if anything, getting worse. Partly because of the relentless push for sales, and partly because fewer people were assigned to make sure that the 161,800 employees in the North American plants were doing their part for Chrysler. Barely 8 weeks before, the tension had come to a head. Cafiero had marched into Ricardo's office in mid-July to announce that he had been offered the chief executive's job at another major company and was going to accept it. "You're not going to go," he told Ricardo. "So I am. Life's too short." Ordinarily, it would have been a perfect opportunity to end a destructive partnership, but Ricardo feared Cafiero's departure would rankle Chrysler's outside directors and perhaps prompt his own removal. A few days later, he went to Cafiero and mutely asked him if he would first talk with the board of directors before making a final decision. Cafiero agreed. 4 directors flew to Detroit and participated in a bizarre series of meetings, first in Cafiero's office, then in Ricardo's. Back and forth they trooped, playing shuttle diplomacy between the 2 top corporate officers. Eventually, the pair made up over a handshake and the directors departed. It was at best a cosmetic reconciliation, a truce between 2 schoolyard toughs, waiting to see who would slip in the next blow. Ricardo was only more frustrated by his inability to convince the board of what he perceived to be Cafiero's glib response to Chrysler's problems. As profit margins shrank across the industry, Chrysler simply could not afford internal strife. Cafiero, however, was fully aware of the disadvantages Chrysler faced, both at home and abroad. He well understood that his was a business that coldly punished its smaller members. Studies of GM and Ford, put into black loose-leaf folders by Chrysler's staff at his behest, made for gloomy reading. Supplementing published reports with tidbits picked up from suppliers, the report showed that in 1977, Chrysler worked with an operating margin per vehicle of just under $700 in the United States and $600 abroad. Ford, by contrast, enjoyed a $967 operating margin in North America and at $1,275, more than twice Chrysler's margin overseas. General Motors, Chrysler's staff calculated, operated with a $1,465 margin in the United States and $1,100 abroad. For companies that measured advantages in pennies and nickels, differences measured in dollars were serious, while differences measured in hundreds of dollars were lethal. "That's a monumental hurdle to get over," Cafiero kept telling his men. "In a downturn, he warned. We're going to be underwater a lot faster than anybody else. The penalties of size were built into every part of the business. Because they rolled out a richer, larger line of cars, GM and Ford made more money from the profitable full-size models. Many of the differences lie far from the showrooms, buried in the size of the company and its plants. At Jefferson Avenue, a Chrysler factory near downtown Detroit, the assembly line ran along an enclosed bridge over the street. 5 separate gates required 5 different teams of blue-jacketed security guards. 20-foot bays instead of the modern 40-foot bays allowed fewer pieces of machinery to slide in and out. Barely 2 miles from Jefferson Avenue, puffs of steam blew from 4 brick stacks in the 70-year-old Hamtramck plant. It cost Chrysler $15 million a year just to heat, and the company had to run the boilers in summer to keep the seals from drying and cracking. Inside, the multi-story assembly line was towed by a drive mechanism, nicknamed elephant balls by the workers, which caused costly losses of production because it kept breaking. GM and Ford, GM more than Ford, used what the manufacturing men called dedicated or captive lines, assembly operations devoted to making a single part. Chrysler made an average of 2.5 parts per line. Consequently, GM and Ford could use more automation. Their plant managers didn't have to worry about changing and warming up presses or readjusting the equipment that nibbled and pecked along the line. In one assembly plant, Chrysler was forced to run 2-door models, 4-door sedans, and station wagons along the same line, so that the men who fitted rear doors had nothing to do each time a 2-door rolled by, giving plant managers distressing problems with line balancing and costing the company plenty in wages and benefits paid for no work. All up and down the innumerable lines of the auto business, Chrysler lost money to its 2 big brothers. Suppliers were more likely to shave a few cents per unit off a 1.2 million unit order from GM than to do so on a 500,000 unit order from Chrysler. Unable to justify building a part themselves, Chrysler's managers all too often had to go to an outside supplier to build the part, paying a premium for the help, and with plants concentrated around Detroit rather than scattered around the country, Chrysler had to pay more in shipping costs. It was small consolation to Gaffiero and Ricardo that Ford, too, paid a penalty to GM. If Chrysler wasn't around, they hollowly reassured themselves, Ford would be in a potload of trouble. The competition, moreover, was no longer just General Motors and Ford. Cheap gasoline in the United States and the subsequent disregard for fuel efficiency still preserved the 2-tier world automobile market that had existed since World War II. Americans built and drove big cars, while everybody else settled for little ones. But in the 70s, when OPEC ruthlessly toyed with the price of oil, the old rules were under increasing pressure. The $72 million item on that morning's Operations Committee agenda was for a 4-door luxury car to be built by Chrysler France. With a 109-inch wheelbase and options for either a 2.2 or 2.6-liter engine, it was still a small car by American standards. In Europe, though, the C9 was bordering on the extravagant. It was supposed to improve Chrysler's dismal European performance the best way Americans knew, by building larger cars and selling them at higher prices. Chrysler Europe needed every bit of help. The large manufacturing plant near Paris, another at Villaverde, lying in the dusty clay countryside south of Madrid, Spain, and 2 in the United Kingdom, Linwood, just outside Glasgow, Scotland, and Wrighton, in the English industrial Midlands, had produced 1/5 of Chrysler's worldwide output in 1977. Although the French and Spanish companies were profitable, the view from Chrysler's British headquarters in London's Bowater House, a stone's throw from the Carlton, was bleak. Chrysler UK was bleeding profusely, and it was only thanks to a hastily arranged 1975 bailout by the British government that Chrysler was keeping its losses under 20 million. Nothing illustrated the changing automobile world more clearly than the Japanese challenge. Ricardo was concerned about Toyota and Datsun, which, together, were selling almost 1 million cars a year in the United States. Behind them, a gaggle of 9 smaller producers, from Honda to Subaru, were keeping pace in what was beginning to strike Ricardo and other American executives as a well-orchestrated invasion. 2 out of every 3 foreign cars sold in the United States in 1977 came on a boat from Japan. The models that poured onto the docks from the doors of the specially built auto transporters were, to Detroit's consternation, more and more closely attuned to American tastes. Toyota had sold its first car in the United States the year before John Ricardo had joined Chrysler. The 919 Toyotas sold in 1958 had been 4,000-pound monsters, little more than a roughly hewn car body sitting on a truck chassis. But in less than 20 years, the Japanese had learned their lessons. The cars now had 2 sun visors, automatic transmissions, stereos, thick-piled carpets, and velour seats. They were starting to be more American than Detroit's finest. To be sure, the Japanese, like the Europeans, stood in a better position to capture the growing population of small car buyers, having long built fuel-efficient cars to sip $2 to $3 worth of gas and to dodge among traffic on narrow roads. The Japanese also seemed to have absorbed the many engineering, production, and advertising tutorials given so freely in America. For the moment, however, John Ricardo was far more concerned with money. The proposed French investment ran against the grain of his financial instincts. Beneath the surface of profitability, Chrysler was losing its market share. From a 16% share in 1976, the company was slipping under 14%, a desperately hard loss to swallow, considering that a single percentage point in a year when more than 10 million cars were made was worth nearly 500 million in revenues. Part of the loss might have been attributed to the growing strength of the Japanese, and part to Chrysler's chronic disadvantages, but a large part could be traced back to the winter of 1974 and the spring of 1975. Toward the end of 1974, as Chrysler rattled toward a loss of 52 million, the Federal Reserve Board had begun closely monitoring the company's cash flow, and Congress considered a $1 billion tax credit to help Chrysler and 2 other troubled companies, Pan American and Lockheed. Fueled by chronic optimism, Ricardo and Lynn Townsend had built up an inventory of nearly 400,000 cars and trucks, which had driven Chrysler deep into despair. For 6 months, the company had bled at a rate of 1.5 million a day, and the pair had reacted by embarking on one of the most draconian cost-cutting binges ever seen in Detroit. To keep the company afloat, Townsend and Ricardo had shut the gates around almost every Chrysler plant and furloughed hundreds of engineers. For 3 months, remarked one of those men, with only slight exaggeration. The only engineers around were working on government regulations. The clockwork timing that accompanies the birth of an automobile, as unalterable and sequential as gestation, had been rudely interrupted. Now, 2 years later, Chrysler was paying the price. Bitterly critical of the 1975 cuts was Douglas Frazier, vice president of the United Auto Workers Union and head of its Chrysler department at the time. The crusty Scotsman, who had 4 decades of experience with Chrysler, first as a worker and then as a labor leader, considered Townsend's handling of the company both inept and inhumane. The wholesale loss of jobs resulting from the 75 crisis had been a scurrilous prologue to the traditional bargaining for the 3-year wage contract due for renewal in 1976. Relations with Chrysler's 100,000 UAW members had long been strained as it was, and the company had been lucky to escape a strike that year. Only at the last minute had Fraser withdrawn from the union's list of demands a proposal for worker representation on Chrysler's board of directors, an old vision of his, but anathema to Detroit's managers. The package won by the union in '76 had raised the cost of Chrysler's production by $100 per car, though, and industry executives fear that the UAW was pricing them out of the world market. The union had always contended, with some justification, that productivity gains outpaced pay hikes. But Chrysler workers had some unusual problems. Around the inner-city plants, absenteeism was well above the industry average. Even after the main contract settlement, there had been wildcat strikes at some facilities, and a 5-week walkout at the St. Louis truck assembly plant in June of 1977 had cost Chrysler more than 20,000 units in production, more than $100 million in foregone sales. From the workers' vantage point, Chrysler was hardly Valhalla. For those who showed up for work, the jobs were demeaning, and lunch breaks still meant a sandwich wolfed astride a wooden bench alongside the line. Workers angrily denounced management's charges of shoddy quality. It was common knowledge among workers in the plants that friends and family of management could get free tune-ups, repairs, even new engines through the back door. If there was a discipline problem at Chrysler, the UAW argued, it cut both ways. By the fall of 1977, it was as obvious to the people on the line as it was to John Ricardo that Chrysler was suffering from the programs delayed 2.5 years earlier. It takes 9 months to make a baby, the engineers recited in Highland Park. But the top executives kept pushing them toward the delivery room, ignoring the risk of miscarriage. They should have known better than to try and play catch-up with Mother Nature. One of the bloodiest births of all had occurred with the 1975 launch of the Aspen Volare, and Chrysler had been desperately trying to correct the deformities for the past 2 years. "We pissed away a car," one executive acidly admitted. "We did the road testing on the first 100,000. Complaints of an alarming tendency for the engine to stall when drivers stepped on the accelerator, of recurring brake failures, and of hoods that flew open at high speeds were piling up in Highland Park and in Washington at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The complaints were the last thing that Ricardo needed, and they dealt a round of stunning blows to Chrysler's reputation for solid engineering. More than 3.5 million Aspens and Volares were called to dealers for free repairs. The changes finally cost the company more than $200 million, and the Center for Auto Safety ridiculed the cars as the 1977 Lemons of the Year. The stalling engines could be partly blamed on changing federal standards on emissions, which Chrysler engineers responded to by taking shortcuts in an effort to reduce pollutants. Part of the problem was caused by a sliver of metal inside the carburetor, specially chosen to save money. The brake and hood defects, however, were entirely due to poor coordination between engineers and manufacturing, a matter of bad management. Within months, an epidemic of fenders riddled with rust broke out. The reason? Workers had failed to spray the underside of the fenders with protective zinc, and inspectors had failed to catch it. The Aspens and Volares were just one of the lines that had been damaged by the cuts of 1974 and 1975. The Omnis and Horizons were going to miss the new model season by 3 months and were scheduled for introduction in January 1978, the worst possible time. At least their development period had been preserved, but General Motors' Alfred Sloan Jr. had long ago devised the formula that made Americans, each October, turn into Pavlovian dogs yelping at the sight of sparkling chrome. and sniffing in search of fresh naga hide. To miss the annual change was costly, especially for a company that could barely afford to spend enough to make buyers even sniff in its direction. After the launch of the Omni Horizons, there would be a gap of 10 months before a new, downsized large car, coated the R body, would appear in the fall of 1978. There was great uneasiness about the cars that would eventually be called St. Regis and New Yorker, not so much because they were large, but because they were late. Management had vacillated on the design in 1975 and then tried to catch up. The car was, in the patios of the trade, signed off. All the important decisions about its length and width, engine and appearance had been made. There were still some weeks left to make changes to the interior and to dicker around with baubles like hood ornaments and instrument panels, but the tooling had been ordered. Both Chrysler and independent machine shops were busy forging the presses and dies, some of which cost $20 million apiece, to bang out the car. By September 1977, the R-body program was a horrendous mess. Metal prototypes, which offer engineers and designers the first solid test of their blueprints, should have been tearing around Chrysler's Chelsea proving grounds outside Detroit for at least 2 months, but no R-body prototype existed. It would be 6 months before a car curled onto the test track, and 7 months before the engineers could start to make changes. If a decent car emerged, it would be a miracle. Less expensive, and certainly less risky, were the cars planned for 1979 and 1980. As cars were crammed within shorter lengths and narrower widths, the need to vary themes grew more important. The L24 program, a sporty 3-door hatchback version of the Omni Horizon, was an attempt to do just that. Meanwhile, though actor Ricardo Montalban was busily rolling his Spanish R's in praise of the genuine Corinthian leather of the Cordoba, Chrysler was planning a new version for 1980. However, there was no bigger nor more important car in the works that fall than the K-body. Detroit tradition held that a body style could be expected to last as long as 10 years, suffering only occasional facelifts or reskins. In 1977, though, when the troubled Aspens and Velares were barely 2 years old, Ricardo and Cafiero were about to approve a replacement for those models, to be launched in the not-too-distant fall of 1981. The decision had been made, and, by September 1977, was nearly a year old. But it was still miles and years from the market of 1981. Many of Chrysler's top managers, including Gene Cafiero and Al Sperlich, a product planner fired from Ford, had originally favored a conventional rear-wheel design for the K-car. Sperlich, who had left Ford shortly after completing work on the rear-wheel drive Fairmont, argued that the Chrysler K-car would have sufficient interior room and a good enough fuel economy rating if it were built in the conventional and cheaper manner. Some others in the engineering department, heavily influenced by the Omni Horizons and, as one explained, bathed in the logic of European small cars, fought furiously for front-wheel drive. By summer, when the decision was made, the European school had won. Sperlich and top management had been converted, and the operations committee had flashed a green light. As Ricardo finished his early morning briefings, modelers were busy peeling and scooping slices of clay from models to be presented for top management review at the end of 1977. For all their concern about General Motors, Chrysler's designers were hardly aware that the compact they were shaping would be nearly identical to GM's X cars. Although they had yet to trim the K-body from 176 inches to 175, to allow 18 rather than 15 to fit on a railcar. Its notched roof and flat hood offered a contrast with the X cars that were being prepared at GM's Tech Center in Warren. But the K car's weight, as well as its wheelbase, engine, and passenger compartment, would be almost identical to the new GM line. The K car also represented the changes taking place in the world's largest automobile companies. One of the central features of the discussion of the French C9 program that Thursday morning was the identification of parts suitable for both the large French luxury car and the compact American model. Both had front-wheel drive, and both called for the use of a 4 or small 6-cylinder engine. Chrysler at last had an opportunity to exploit the advantages of common production of major components. The new cars could fit both tiers of the world market and could be built from parts produced in different places. Despite the differences between the C9 and the K-body, they roughly fit the definition of a new buzzword flashing around Detroit. The Chrysler cars promised to be world cars. Predicting the shape of future markets and developing such concepts to match them had always been a challenging game, though expensive. Now, the stakes seemed too high and the chances for success too low. What if the C9 turned out to be too big for the France of 1981? And what if Americans didn't want cars as small as the K-body? It was an unnerving choice and a business long unsuitable for the faint of heart. Jean Ricardo had never had much confidence in his own judgment about new cars. The growing uncertainty left him all the more disturbed that he was leaving major decisions in the hands of a chief operating officer whom he did not trust. He had no choice, though, but to live under the cool entente established in July, leaving the cars to others while he tried to figure out how in the world Chrysler could pay for all that needed to be done. More comfortable with drawing up financial projections, Ricardo concluded that Chrysler's plans through 1982 would cost some $7.5 billion, more than double the investments made during the previous 5 years. Assuming a steady economy, as many were, Ricardo expected the market to supply some $3.6 billion in revenues, plus another $2.6 billion in depreciation and amortization allowances. Like other executives, Ricardo moaned that the allowances were nowhere near generous enough to pay for the gutting of America's aging factories. But there was scant time for such thoughts. Somewhere, somehow, John Ricardo had to find another $1.3 billion. One source of these funds, of course, would be the banks. The banking community had bailed Chrysler out in the wake of the Penn Central panic in 1970 and had agreed to provide fresh credit in the darkest days of 1974. The banks earned huge interest payments and scarcely bothered to question how the same company could lose $312 million in 1974 and 1975 and be massively profitable 2 years later. Chrysler, the bankers told themselves, was like a thin layer of water. When the wind blew, it rose pretty fast, and when the wind died down, it went down even faster. Big bankers and auto executives shared at least one truism. Volume is the name of the game. And Chrysler, wallowing in more debt than either Ford or General Motors, was the best customer in Detroit. Ricardo also knew that Wall Street could be counted upon for at least $150 million in a well-timed preferred stock offering. An employee stock plan, always good for morale, might be tapped for another $50 million a year. In the final analysis, though, Chrysler would have to average a net profit of $140 million for each of the next 5 years to pay for the cars it planned for the 80s. Given that net profits during the previous 10 years had only averaged $123 million, Ricardo knew there was not even the thinnest of safety nets. Indeed, the 9 operations committee executives couldn't afford to keep pumping money into Europe, into South America, into Australia, into real estate, outboards and chemicals, into anything except the cars and trucks it would take to stay alive in North America, where Walter Chrysler had carved himself a piece of a growing industry 50 years before. The baggage of the 1960s, collected with equal boldness by Lynn Townsend during the years when American managers and American dollars were supposed to be able to turn any factory into gold, could not be carried much further. John Ricardo was a worrier by nature, and that fall he had good reason to worry. The future was frustratingly obscure, but certain to be dangerous. The federal government was increasingly hostile and unsympathetic toward the problems of the industry. Workers seemed to grow more alienated by the day. Chrysler's internal controls were no longer in Ricardo's hands, and perhaps were out of control altogether. Costs were rising, sales were falling. Resources had been cut too deep for comfort. In a business where numbers came in boxcars, and the whims of any 1,000 customers meant a swing in profits or losses of millions of dollars, forecasting was a wild and often futile exercise. For what they were worth, the projections beyond 1977 were not healthy. Chrysler's fate, it seemed that September morning, was perhaps beyond any man's control. The $72 million expenditure for the C9 program was approved, and the car itself was produced in France, not as a Chrysler, but as a Talbot Tagora, a top-of-the-line model for a troubled division of the Peugeot Group in 1981. In America, the K-car was born too, but in a Chrysler and in an automobile industry worlds removed from the one in which it was conceived.